All right, welcome to class, everybody. We're gonna move on to we're gonna keep hopping around a little bit in our class. We finished our discussion on the first article of the Creed, which is how God the Father created all things through His Son by the power of His Holy Spirit. So, just remember the review or the order of this class is not so much following the order that's in the catechism, but it's following this storyline. So just by way of review where we're at, right? So God created the heavens and the earth and everything was good and wonderful. Then creation fell. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then right after the fall, God promised that He was going to send a deliverer, send a redeemer who would fix everything that was broken in creation, and how the Old Testament is the beginning of the fulfillment of that promise. God chooses one family out of all the families in the world to be the family from whom that promised child would come. That's the family of a man by the name of Abraham, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob, who's also known as Israel. Israel's children end up in Egypt, and where they are enslaved brutally. God rescues His people from slavery in Egypt and brings them to Mount Sinai, where He gives them the 10 Commandments, among some other laws. And in those 10 Commandments, He says, this is how you are going to be my people, my chosen people, who will fulfill the purposes that I have for you on earth. So that's where we're at in the storyline today. Before we go into the 10 Commandments themselves, does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns about anything we've talked about thus far, or anything in general?
I knew about that sermon, but I think I sidetracked the whole class if I brought it up.
That's fine.
So my biggest thing on that one 10 months ago, and I don't know what he preached about today because I didn't go yet, is the biggest thing I hate about every time they talked about security here is security is not guns.
Right.
And guns are not security.
Right.
But every time we've talked about it, that's the only thing we talk about.
Mhm.
And then we've left security off the table.
Right.
And
So-
like, what? With the exception of some of what we've learned, but like when we talked about like verbal de-escalation and talking to people, like when we did that training, I'm like, I think we're a bad church for not doing what they're saying. Like, there's simple things like meeting people and at the door and like
Right.
welcoming them.
Yes. Amen, brother.
Like, why aren't we doing that? But then like every time we bring it up, all we ever talk about is guns.
So this one didn't
That's
actually,
what drives me nuts.
this sermon didn't talk all about church security.
Mhm.
This was about personal self-defense, this sermon
No.
was. But you're right. If we welcome people, the verbal de-escalation,
Yeah.
right? Those things go hand in hand with just being a warm, friendly, welcoming place.
Yeah, but it seems like every time we brought this up,
Yep.
yeah, the conversation always goes to the gun side of it,
Mm-hmm.
and then like the whole other side just gets left off the table.
Right.
And that's what frustrates me. And I know I have a different view on things because of what I do. So
Mhm.
for you two, if you don't know, I'm a EMT in Joplin, a firefighter here. So like I see the screwed up things that are going on in the world. I've seen people beat to death. I've seen kids beat to death.
Mm-hmm.
Seen people shot and die. You know, and it's just like if people don't think that it's out there, like you don't really know what's going on.
Right.
And then just like the training of how to triage kids, like I think that's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about it is I know how to triage kids and I don't ever want to do it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the thought that I might have to make a decision of like I don't have time to help this kid because he's so bad that I gotta move on to someone else. Like that just eats me up, and that's why I get really frustrated, real passionate about. But that sermon. Because you address guns on that one, but like
Did I talk about church security?
you did, but
Okay.
I got the hint that it has been brought up in like elders or church council again. Was my assumption,
Yeah. No, you're right.
and that's where I got frustrated with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be honest with you, when they first started that, they sent out a questionnaire and it said, "Do you think people should carry in church, and then it said, if yes, would you be willing to do it? And I'm like, hold on, I don't think people should, but if someone is going to, I want to be one of the ones that do it.
Right.
You know?
And that's when you write on the bottom, your survey is wrong.
Yeah, you know, it's just like, no,
I
don't think
reject
we
your
need to
false
do it.
choice.
Yeah, I don't think we need to do it just because, honestly, on a whole, another reason why I don't believe, I guess not really anything you hit on that day, just from a
Yeah.
tactical, you
No,
can't.
we need to keep it a broader topic. And how do we, are there ways that we can, are there other options beyond shooting a guy?
100%.
Right? If our desire is to save other people, right? What's our desire? Save other people. How do we do that?
From a teacher's perspective, I kind of feel trapped, because I feel like I don't answer the question because I don't think people are gonna like my response. But, it's like, cause, something was brought up about teachers, teachers caring. And I'm like, I personally don't, feel comfortable, like shooting someone. But then I'm just like, okay, so is that, like an expectation, so I'm like, of course, like I protect my kids. And I would protect my kids, like even if it means, endangering myself. I don't have any problem with that. But I'm like, I still kind of have a hang up of, well, what does that look like? Am I willing to shoot somebody to protect my kids? And I'm like, I don't exactly feel comfortable with that.
So the sermon today was all about this kind of concept that in America, especially in conservative areas, there are people that get awfully excited about the possibility of a home invader so that they can shoot them, right? Self-defense. Like, Vic and I were talking about this sermon all week, and I got my taxes done on Monday, and there was a guy who was insanely excited at the tax office that there was a home invasion and the guy got shot because of it. I'm like, that's not like, and then what we wanted to do, and what Vicar I think did a very well and very measured job with, is how does that actually stack up to Jesus' teaching in the New Testament? And that's basically all he did. And I think he did a very good job of keeping it focused and on that, saying, what does Jesus teach? And let's just see where that goes. And I think one of the things that does is it does allow us to broaden the topic beyond just guns. But that wasn't the place for it in that sermon, right? So your passion might be one of those things that we figure out how to harness. Because it's, the stuff falls off the table. For me, as a pastor, it becomes I just don't have the time and energy to make everything my thing that I'm passionate about. Not to say that it isn't important, but I think what we need to do is figure out how do we tap into people's passions and let them kind of run with it and see where it goes and harness that into something good and holy for the good of the church.
And it's not only, don't get me, I'm not pointing just you.
Yeah,
I had this frustration with almost everybody, I'll be honest with you, because before we did all of this, we had a day we went out shooting out at David's, just like shooting targets and stuff.
Yeah.
And I tell you, there is, if you took every single person that goes to this church, there might be 3 people that have the ability, in my opinion, to carry around in a public place.
Yeah.
And that was the thing I tried to bring up in the voters meeting, and I don't think people realize when you get put in that high stress of a situation,
Mm-hmm.
you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your lowest level of training, and there's not enough people don't have that training.
I think I've heard you say that before.
Yeah, Socrates.
Every class I take that's what you do.
Socrates said it in 300,
Yeah.
300.
Yeah, BC. He was
Yeah.
before Christ.
And
Yeah.
and he was 100% spot on, and it just drives me nuts. And I remember their argument was, well, yeah, my daughter, she'd never shot a gun before, and she went to a self-defense or a concealed carry class, and she learned so much. I'm like, and you're saying that's all they need to that's a whole other argument. But
Through 2 self-defense, through both of the times I got qualified in Texas, I had a live weapon pointed at me in both people were given licenses.
Yeah, I think I
Huh.
could probably, I think I
That's
could probably
scary.
do it with my left hand, and if you let me see the target and then cover my eyes up, I probably could still qualify. Like, I mean, it was.
It's not that hard.
It's not hard, like,
Yeah.
I probably couldn't cover my eyes up and qualify, but I guarantee I could qualify with my left hand.
There's a lady there about your size, and we all had Glock 17s. My weapon jammed. While I'm on the floor,
Oh my
the
gosh.
instructor tackled her.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Austin
And
and
she's
I
still
both
Yikes.
had, like, both have our, I only took the class because he wanted me to with him, but I don't have anything to do with. And I'm like, and I know nothing about, I had never even handled a gun before that class, and I just took it, you know, because it was something, take interest in your, you know, in your husband's interest. So I took it with them, and I never actually went through with getting it, but, you know, I took the class and I passed, so I qualified for concealed carrying, never even touching a weapon before.
Huh.
the other side I would like to, and you alluded to it that day, but said that it was a topic for a different day, was, how it applies to military and police, because, like, I know I'm not an officer, but, like, I push the line of, like, we're very aggressive in Joplin, like, you don't wanna cover your ears, hon. Like, we're
Earmuffs.
we're trying to go into, they call them warm zones, so like if there's an active shooter, we're going in and with vests and, and we're taught how to not really use weapons, but if an officer's down, how to, essentially, you know, not really use the weapons, but unload them, and obviously the
Yeah.
assumption is if it leads into something where you had to use it, you'd use it, and like, where does that all
Our,
fall into?
I think we can say this. Long story short, and then we're going to get to the Ten Commandments. The death of a human being at the hands of another human being is never God's ideal, right? And that will always cause difficulty, stress, the need for counseling. It causes damage to the person who does the shooting, I think. If it doesn't, then there's other problems that need to be. Within our Lutheran confession, there is allowance for, within certain vocations, certain roles, that people are able to use lethal force. Those being as a soldier and as like a police officer, executioner, those kind of things. Why is that? Is because they are acting as the arms of the government who has been specifically authorized by God, according to Romans 13, to be able to wield the sword to punish evildoers. That being said, still not good, right? Like, there's a reason why the guillotine was invented, right? Because it turns out executing people with a sword is really hard, and most executioners were like alcoholics and were so drunk when they would execute people, they would miss a bunch of times. And so they're like, yeah, we need to take the human element out of this beyond pulling a lever. So, like, it's, yeah. So, yeah. That being said, right, I'm not being like, yeah, good for you, you shot the bad guy, right? No, like, you did your duty. You know, Luther compares it to, in another work, this isn't part of our Lutheran confessions, he compares it to sawing a gangrenous limb off, right? It's not like, no one's like, yay, right, but you've survived, right? So it's good for everyone as a whole, but it's still a bad thing, right? It might just be the best that we can get in this sinful, fallen world. Speaking of the sinful, fallen world, that's what I want to talk about today, right? To kind of get into that, right? So as I was telling the story, Adam and Eve were placed in the Garden of Eden, and when they were placed in the Garden of Eden, God told them to take care of creation. He said, you can eat of the tree, the fruit of any tree of the garden, except this one tree, that's off limits, which tells us that limits, boundaries, laws, and rules are not evil. They're actually good. We experience them as evil the vast majority of the time. So rules, limits, boundaries, laws, if you will, are actually built into creation. And we see this all the time with no problem with like things like gravity, right? What do we call gravity? It's a law of physics, right? Inertia and all that thing. It's just built into how the world works. Now, a human being can choose to ignore the law of gravity. How's that going to work for them? say, I'm going to ignore gravity and walk off the edge of this building. I think that law is silly and made up by a bunch of people who want to take my fun away. How does that end up for him?
It's law of gravity shows up no matter what.
Right, right. It turns out, so that's the physical side of God's law. There's a moral, ethical side of it too. That God has just built into his creation. This is how his creation functions. And if you ignore that, things go a little haywire. This is what happened with Adam and Eve, right? The one rule, don't eat of this tree, the knowledge of good and evil. They, as the story goes, the serpent, we learn later in the New Testament, was Satan, either possessing or in the form of a serpent, came up and tempted Eve to eat that fruit. He tempted her by getting her to doubt God's word, which is always where any temptation starts. As soon as the question says, did God really say? Because that's what the serpent says. Did God really say that you weren't supposed to eat of it? Right? And then Eve fires back, well, I'm not supposed to eat of it or touch it. Right? And the thing is, God didn't say not touch it, right? Well, that was a good idea, right? If it's forbidden, you probably shouldn't be, petting it and touching it, that kind of thing either. But she added to God's word. So Satan caused her to question God's word. She misquoted God and then opened herself up to temptation. So we need to make sure as we deal with temptation ourselves that we actually know what God says. And when Satan says, did God really say? What did God actually say? That's worthwhile paying attention. So once she took that fruit, ate it, she gave the fruit to her husband, who, as I read the story, was standing right there next to her, whose job it was to protect and guard his wife. He let her eat the fruit. Adam ate the fruit himself. At that point, they fell. God's perfect creation wasn't perfect anymore. We talked about this in the introduction. If you have a perfect masterpiece, say your masterful woodworking piece that you've spent eons in, I think I used you as the example the last time we went through this, right? What if someone, if Amy came by and, spilled varnish all over it, right? What would you do?
Not be happy.
You would not be happy. You'd probably curse if you're a normal human being, right? I think most of us would curse in a situation like that. But the difference, our curses are ineffective, don't really do anything. They're just sound. God's word, again, because God spoke the universe into existence. When God says something, it happens. So God cursed, it actually happened. So God curses his creation. And we see the curse show up in kind of three things. And I'll just, actually it'd probably just be easier to pull it up in the Bible here. This is in Genesis chapter 3. Let's see whose Bible that is. Oh, no, you can't. It's not on screen. Okay, so we have this curse. The first thing that God does is he curses the serpent. He says, "Cursed are you above all the livestock and all the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat the dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. And he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." So that is the promise of essentially the promise of Jesus. The first promise of the gospel, that someone would come, an offspring of Eve, descendant of Eve, who would crush the head of the serpent. Okay, then the curse goes on to the woman. He said, "I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to your children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Okay, so how do we understand this curse? This is not just that bearing children hurts. We always need to remember why Eve was created. Eve was created because it was not good for man to be alone. And so from Eve flows human relationship and human community. The curse directed against her is a curse against human community. Childbearing, as I have just celebrated my oldest my oldest child's 11th birthday, that pain in childbearing goes way past the birth pains. It seemingly only gets worse as time goes on, especially as we're getting closer to the preteen years. And I have a son who's as strong-willed as my wife. So the relationships that should cause women the most joy end up causing them the most pain. And just ask your mothers, right? When did I break your heart, Mom? And she'll tell you, because she remembers, because that left a scar on her. And then she says, then God says, your desire will be for your husband. The sense of this in the Hebrew is your desire will be to be master over your husband. Your desire will be to control your husband, to parent your husband. Okay? But then it says, and he will rule over you. So what we have is two people trying to master each other for control. How does that work out? You got two people trying to hold on to the wheel. Not well, right? It ends in conflict. So the curse against Eve is this. All human society, all human relationships are now, yes, a source of joy, but also a source of incredible pain. Okay? Do we see that in life? How that kind of plays out? Of course we do, right? And especially the people you love the most are the best people best positioned to hurt you the most, right? And then we get the curse to Adam, right? To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree of which I commanded you, you must not eat. So before we get any further, right? So this is where we see things like fights in families, dysfunctional families, all the way up to international wars, right? Humanity's at war with itself. Okay? Cursed is the ground because of you. So not just humanity is cursed, but even the very ground. And this is actually logical because the word for ground in Hebrew is the same word for man in Hebrew. It's Adam. So he is, the ground is cursed. And what is a result of it, right? Through painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. So Adam was created to work the ground, was created to take care of creation. Now creation fights against him in that act, right? So we see both with Adam and Eve, the very purposes for which they were created because of the curse are turned in upon themselves. And we see it play out in life. So where do we see creation, the curse in creation, and it working against humans? He gives a pretty obvious example right here. Farming, right? It's not an easy gig, is it? Whether it's like the crops working out, don't get pests, blight, not enough water, that sort of thing. What would raising cattle look like if you just whistled and they all ran to you and like happily jumped into the stock, right? It'd be a lot easier, right? Animals now run from us because now they're terrified of us because of the curse, right? You ever been bit by a dog? There you go. My little girl was scratched by her kitty last night. Of course, she kind of carries that cat around like a rag doll, so it's like, well, you just leave Frisky alone. So we see that curse. So we see this from little things like a cat scratching a 2-year-old girl to big things like earthquakes, tsunamis, wildfires, etc. So we see all that creation broken. What we're looking for is the fulfillment of this promise where, not that one, this one, where Jesus is going to come and undo that curse. He's going to fix that curse, right? God doesn't let creation stay the way that it is. As I was saying, right, this is part of the Ten Commandments is the realization for how that happens. So you see in the historical context, the reason why we have some of these symbols here, right? So what do we have there? What is that? A mountain and it's a plant. What can we say about that plant? It's burning, right? So this is a reference to Mount Sinai and the burning bush. Okay? That's the historical context of which the Ten Commandments were originally given. That the burning bush is how God showed up to Moses when Moses was a shepherd. and called him to save his people. The mountain the burning bush was on is also the same mountain that God gave the Ten Commandments on, which is Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, depending on which part of the Bible you're looking at. It's a mountain with two names. So that's why that is there, the historical context of it. So as we were talking about what the Ten Commandments are and what God's law is, we were talking about, remember how creation has God's law is just built into it, that this is how everything is designed to function best. And that's really what the Ten Commandments are, is the summary of God's law / will. That is to say, it is how he designed creation to function. So, how did he design you guys to function? That's what we have recorded for us in the Ten Commandments. Okay? One of the things you'll notice that's floating above these Ten Commandments is the cross of Christ. Right? So the cross of Christ shows us that as we look at these Ten Commandments, we filter them through the teachings of Jesus. So what this will become very obvious with something like the fifth commandment, which touches on today's sermon, you shall not murder, right? Well, you think, well, I've done just a fine job. I've never murdered anybody, so I've kept that. But then we look at Jesus' teaching in regard to murder and things like anger. And he says, yeah, don't even be angry with someone. And if you ever call someone a bad name in anger, you're sinning very badly. So you need to not do that.
So what is the, because you'll see in thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill, which one is the better translation? Murder or kill?
I think at that point, I want to know why the person wants to know.
So the a book I read, he's a doctorate in psychology, military science, and he works with a lot of veterans. And he said he runs into a lot of veterans that think they're going to hell because they have killed.
Right?
And he explains to them that the correct, his explanation is the correct translation is murder, not kill. And
Right.
there's a big difference between killing and murdering.
So I think that's the one issue there is dealing with a guilty conscience. Right? I think justifying a guilty conscience is not the way to do it, which is what that, as a pastor, that's not how I would handle it. I'm not going to fault this guy for trying to deal with that situation in the way that he deals with it. My training and resources would say, when someone's got a guilty conscience, it's because they're reacting to something that is eating them up inside. It's better to probably just acknowledge that that pain is there because what happened isn't, it's not how God designed creation to work. So whether we've killed someone or murdered someone, a human life is ended. So let's just take a moment and say, that's awful. Now, will that send you to hell? Absolutely not. Right? And that's where we talk about not dismissing the sin, but actually acknowledging the sin, confessing it, and saying, Jesus died for that sin specifically. You are forgiven. And not only that, as a pastor, I'm actually put here by God to specifically announce God's forgiveness to people. And we get to do that as often as needed, right? Over and over and over and over again until that actually gets internalized. Right? So either way that you look at it, sometimes, if we're saying, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder, sometimes someone could say, well, are there reasons why are there places, situations which I could kill someone and it wouldn't be murder? It's like, you're trying to get around God's law at that point. You're trying to find those situations where I don't actually have to listen to Jesus. Right? And it's like, you don't want to do that. You want to just take it as it is. And this is like that feeling that soldiers have, they feel horrible about ending someone's life. That's kind of the natural law that's built into them.
Yeah,
And
he talks a lot about that. It's really almost morbid if you hear the name of the book, but it is, it's super interesting. He talks about that. He talks about how That's the reason you talk about the guillotine. That's the reason why there's a firing squad. So
Mhm.
you cannot tie it to. And he talks about how, as it gets closer, how much harder it is for people. And the only people that are not subject to that are like psychopaths.
Right.
essentially.
And that's why, like, we see governments in the last century doing what they did to soldiers to try and remove that moral component of their brains to turn them into perfect killing machines. And this is why I think Rambo, the first one of the best movies ever made. I really think so. All the other Rambos were terrible, but the first Rambo is fantastic because it talks about the damage that we do to our soldiers by trying to turn them into something that God did not design them to be, killing machines.
Yeah. And he is super against, which I know is a totally another conversation, but video games. And I never was a proponent of that until he started explaining like why. And like he does a really, really good job of explaining.
Well, I think I shared with you the story about my brother who just retired from being a major in the National Guard. Did I ever share this with you? That he went to officer training kind of later in life. So he was probably in his mid-40s when he went to officer training, and he was going to officer training with a bunch of guys that were in their early 20s. And part of their officer training was they had to watch video recordings of people being blown up, shot, killed, that kind of thing, to kind of say this is the stuff you got to prepare for. He said his cohort, these young guys, would laugh when they would watch that stuff, and he was just so disgusted by it.
So his
yeah.
big thing was in World War II, if a soldier had an opportunity to shoot at another soldier, like an opposing enemy, what percentage of the time do you think they took the shot?
I don't know.
15% of the time.
Yeah.
Only 15% of the time they chose to shoot at them. In Vietnam, it got up to, depending on who you talk to, 90 to 92%. The only thing that they changed in their training, they changed them from round targets to a silhouette of a human.
Oh, really?
So they were used to shooting at
Another human being.
another human being, and I just kind of like tied it to my personal life. Like I remember, like when I was growing up, like even toy guns, you didn't shoot each other. Like if you had a stick gun, you did not shoot somewhere. I got
Right.
in trouble. And I remember shooting. First time I shot a silhouette, like my heart rate was racing because of that. Sorry. I didn't mean to-
No, you're fine. You're fine. The bells are going off that I'm trying to
No.
do
All right,
multiple
I'll
things.
let you go on.
You're absolutely right, though.
No. But yeah,
Yes.
It's interesting. He had some good points.
So my answer on that would kill, murder. In the end, it probably doesn't matter. I think what matters is what is the question behind that. Is someone dealing with a guilty conscience? I deal with it that one way. Is someone trying to say, well, there are circumstances and situations with which I can get out of God's law and actually end someone's life? That's a different discussion, right?
Yeah.
So sorry, I didn't mean to. I was listening. I was paying attention. I got concerned that I was late. Okay, so within that law, you'll notice here that there are 2 tablets. Okay? We got this tablet and this tablet. Now, what do you notice about the ordering? How many are on here? 3. How many are in here? Right? There's 7. So there's 10 commandments. Why is it divided out this way? Because a lot of times in artwork, you'll see 1 through 5 here and 6 through 10 divided that way. The reason this is a teaching tool, this is not scriptural, but it's a really handy teaching tool, where we talk about thematically the 2 tables of the law, and the first 3 commandments deal with our relationship towards God and the laws in regard with our relationship to Him. So this would be, you shall have no other gods, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, and remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 4 through 10 then deal with our relationship with other humans. So this would be honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, and you shall not covet your neighbor's house and your neighbor's stuff. So those are the 10 commandments themselves. That's why they're divided out there in that way. Within that, it's probably worth noting that if you came from a non-Lutheran tradition or non-Catholic tradition, we're going to number the commandments differently. So,
You found that out.
yes.
Sharing religion this year.
Yep. So we know that there's 10 commandments, but when you look at the text, there's a whole lot of you shalls. There's about 13. So the question is, which ones are explanations to the 10 commandments and which ones are the 10 commandments themselves? Different Christian traditions have actually answered this differently. Where the biggest divide comes off is right at the beginning, which is the first commandment. Is obviously, all Christians agree on this: you shall have no other gods. And then right after that, God says, and you shall make no graven images. Okay? Lutherans and Roman Catholics have always understood that you shall make no graven images as kind of the obvious implication of you shall have no other gods. Well, if I can't have no other gods, of course I can't make graven images, right, and worship them. That's just obvious. Obvious explanation.
Then that doesn't make sense with 9 and 10, because 9 and 10 are essentially the same thing.
They're not. I'll teach you why.
Okay.
Why that's the case, why they're not the
That's
same.
what
They're
I
very
noticed
closely
the
related.
difference was in 9 and 10.
They're very closely related, right? So other Christians, this would be like those of the kind of evangelical, what we would call evangelical today, Christians, Baptists, Pentecostals, Reformed Christians who came through John Calvin, if you're familiar with that name at all, the Wesleyan tradition. For them, they take you shall make no graven images as the second commandment, and then the ordering gets different from there. Where it sorts out at the end is for us, 9 and 10, both have to do with coveting, but they come with coveting different things. Coveting, 9 for us is coveting people's stuff. 10 is coveting others people's people. And that actually it matters how we actually live that out, as we'll talk about that later on. So I'll try very hard for you ladies that didn't come from Roman Catholic tradition. Brandon's okay, because that's the tradition he came from, so his numbering is going to be the same as mine. That when I say the number of a commandment and you go, that's not the commandment that I think of when you say commandment number 4, right? Because commandment number 4 for me is honor your father and mother. Commandment number 4 for other types of Christians is remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. So if I ever do that, I didn't do it on purpose. Just stop me if you're confused, and I'll be more than happy to clarify. Any questions about that? Okay. One last thing before we actually get into the Ten Commandments itself. We're not actually going to get to the Ten Commandments themselves just yet. This week we can hold off that to next week. So come back next week and we'll talk about idolizing our rights, like we were talking about an hour ago, right? The law, the Ten Commandments, as it functions for us, has 3 functions. So why does God give the law? What does the law do? And for this, we have 3 helpful images. The first is as a curb. So you can think of the curb like this. So this is my terrible drawing skill. Okay? So this is our perspective drawing of a road. Okay, you can tell because they're driving into the sunset. Okay. All right. And, this is something that's very foreign to anyone who's raised and lives in Lockwood. But most places have these things called curbs, right? So it are curbs that actually goes, it separates the road from not the road. Okay? So there are these little things that go here along the side of the road, right? Sometimes other places have these things called sidewalks. Those are pretty cool. Right? So say someone's driving along the road, right? That's their square car. So they're driving along the road, and Grandma Schmidt is walking with her cane down the sidewalk, right? And person here driving down the road, looking at their phone while they're driving down in their car, getting distracted, looking at squirrels. So they don't have their phone, they're looking at squirrels. Or they're like marveling the paint of houses. I don't know what gets you distracted. I bet I could sell that person some better paint, right? They're driving along, get distracted, looking off that way, and they start to go right. What is there to prevent Grandma Schmidt from getting nailed by that car? Is the curb, right? You hit the curb first before you hit Grandma Schmidt. So the curb keeps the car in bounds. This is what the law does. The law keeps reality, keeps the world in bounds from getting too evil so that a lot of Grandma Schmidts don't get splattered by evil. Okay? So it would be simply like this. The law functions like this way. It's a warning. Don't murder someone or you're going to be murdered. Okay? And it goes even a little bit deeper to say when you murder someone, you're going to be eaten up inside. Or when you kill someone. Again, semantics at that point. You steal, what's going to happen to you?
You're gonna get stolen from.
You might get stolen from, or you'll get arrested, unless you live in a blue state. And not so much. You gotta let me throw one in there for you.
He's like, no comment.
Right, so that's how the law functions. Is it actually just it keeps the knowledge that for some people, if I do that, that's wrong. That's enough, right? That's how it curves. That's my wife. There are rules, and there are rules because they're rules, so we have to follow them. How do we know we have to follow them? Because they're rules, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be rules. For me, I need the stick, right? For me to follow a rule, there's got to be a punishment. Both of those things, however they function, whether you have an actually well-developed conscience like my wife, or like me, a pastor who has no conscience, and just needs someone to hurt me in order to get me to do it. I was spanked a lot as a kid. That's how that functions. Okay, the other one is a mirror, right? And what do mirrors do? They show you yourself as you really are. Sometimes in our mental image, this is especially true of guys, we think we're pretty hot stuff, right? And then we catch a glimpse in our mirror and realize that our paunch is getting pretty big and the hair's thinning a little bit more and we got a lot more gray than we thought we did. Maybe our mustache isn't as cool as we thought, right? So when that happens, right, what the mirror as the law shows us, the mirror, it functions as a mirror as it shows us our sin. So it shows us where we've failed, where we have not lived like we should, where we've messed up, fallen short of God's glory, fallen short of His expectations for us. As we'll see later on, in that sense, the law is very, 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 very important, and we would say this is, in fact, its primary purpose. And its ultimate purpose is because when you are recognizing your sin, just how bad you are, you're recognizing also your need for someone to help you and save you. And so what it does in showing us our sins, showing us our failures, is it points us to Jesus Christ, where we can be forgiven. Okay? So that's how it functions as a mirror. And the last one is it functions as a guide. Kind of think of it like a guidebook. I've started to teach my confirmation kids, because they don't know what a guidebook is anymore. I say this is a YouTube tutorial. So it shows you how to do something. So how do you live as a Christian? How does Jesus want you to live as His disciples? You look to the law. And specifically, you look at His teaching. So this is where things get amplified, where it's not just negative stuff, but it's actually positive stuff. So it's like, oh yeah, you need to love people. Right? It's not just not killing them, but you need to love them. You need to love God. You need to forgive, right? Things like that. These are the things that teach you how to live as a Christian. So, curb keeps the car, the world, the evil of the world from getting too far out and smishing Grandma Schmidt. Mirror shows us our sin. and our desperate need for someone to save us because we are just broken. And, you know, with a mirror, right? Like I said, you don't often notice your faults until you see, oh, I have spinach in my teeth. How long has that been there? And then Guided actually shows us how to live out our lives as Christians. Okay, any questions on that stuff? All right, so we'll call that quits for today. And we'll come back next week to actually get into the commandments themselves. But thank you for your questions. They were fantastic, your discussion today. That was good stuff as always.